Welcome to The Explainer. Let's jump right in. Today, we're setting the stage for a fascinating journey back to early 18th century North America. We're going to zero in on a pivotal moment, specifically right around the year 1713, when vastly different worlds, cultures, and economic systems were intersecting. It's really a story about the fundamental differences in how settlers and indigenous peoples viewed the very earth they stood on. So I want to start by posing a really crucial question directly to you. Who owned North America in 1713? Think about that for a second, because if you lived back then in a French colony, a British settlement, or an indigenous village, your answer to that question would be completely different depending on your worldview. And honestly, this single question sits at the absolute heart of the historical conflict over the land. It's going to guide our entire exploration today.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really understand this era, we first need to wrap our heads around the concept of disputed territory, which is simply land over which different groups are arguing and claiming ownership. When European maps were being drawn up in the 1500s and 1600s, they basically carved up the continent into British territory, French territory, and Spanish territory. But huge swaths of the map were considered disputed. The wild part? These European maps and the actual indigenous realities on the ground painted two totally different pictures of the exact same continent.
First Nations, land, and harmony. Let's take a look at our first major perspective, exploring the deep, organized connection Indigenous peoples had with the landscape long before any Europeans arrived. It's really interesting to see how different First Nations structured their entire societies around the sustainable use of local resources. On one hand, you have groups like the Haudenosaunee and Huron nations. They were farmers. By growing crops like corn, squash, and beans, they could sustain these incredibly dense villages of over 1,000 people. But they understood the limits of the soil, so they'd actually relocate their entire villages roughly every 20 years when the farmland needed to rest. Contrast that with the Algonquian peoples. Because they relied heavily on hunting and fishing, they absolutely needed large roaming territories so the local wildlife could survive and replenish. Because of this, they lived in much smaller mobile groups of about 50 people. The environment literally dictated their societal structure.
So the big takeaway here is that to the First Nations, the land was definitely not empty. It was deeply utilized and profoundly respected. Literally, every plant, tree, and animal had a purpose, whether that was for food, shelter, medicine, or spiritual ceremonies. Settlements were very strategically built near water for drinking and transportation. And perhaps most importantly, they had established vast, highly functional trade networks way before European ships ever appeared on the horizon. The land provided everything necessary for life.
Settlers, claims, and wealth. Now, let's shift gears and look at the Europeans. When explorers like John Cabot or Jacques Cartier showed up, they came with fundamentally different reasons for being in North America.
Take a look at this fascinating early map. Notice how it highlights the abundance of local wildlife. Specifically, you can see the beavers building dams. When the Europeans looked at North America, they didn't see a complex network of existing indigenous nations. They saw a massive, untapped opportunity. They saw jobs. They saw extreme wealth, and they saw a practical way to supply the rapidly growing demands of populations back home in Europe.
I think nothing captures this mindset better than this quote from 1497 by Raimondo de Cincino. He was an ambassador who sailed with Caboto, and he wrote back to Europe saying, "The sea is covered with fish, will fetch so many fish that this kingdom will have no more need of Iceland." The sheer, unbelievable abundance is really what drove early European interest. Fish was incredibly valuable back then because it could be easily preserved with salt and transported on ships during long voyages to feed the masses in Europe. Now, check out the fashion in this 1646 drawing of a wealthy European woman draped in fur. Believe it or not, high-end European fashion trends literally drove global exploration. Because beaver fur is naturally waterproof, it made the ultimate luxury hat. But over in Europe, the demands of a growing population had pushed most local fur-bearing animals near extinction. To stay warm and to display their wealth, Europeans desperately needed a new source for fur. And this creates such a fascinating historical contrast. The European view of fur was all about high-end luxury fashion and showcasing wealth. But the First Nations view of fur? It was simply an everyday necessity to survive the freezing winters. Initially, First Nations peoples didn't even fully grasp why Europeans were so desperate to trade highly valuable practical items, like metal pots and tools, in exchange for common animal skins. But because the trade immensely benefited both sides, it spread like wildfire. Clashing views on land. So we have two vastly different cultures with fundamentally different worldviews. A total collision over the concept of ownership was absolutely inevitable. To understand how Europeans justified claiming the land, we really have to look at the historical documents of the time. This quote is from a published sermon by a preacher in 1609. He wrote, "It is likely to be true that these savages have no particular property in any part or parcel of that country, but only a general residency there, as wild beasts in the forest." This perfectly demonstrates a foundational European assumption. Because indigenous peoples didn't build European-style fences or stone cities, the settlers just assumed they wandered the land aimlessly without actually claiming or owning it. And this next quote brilliantly illustrates the culture clash. Read this from Mississauga Ojibwe Chief Peter Jones. Each tribe has its own range of country, and sometimes each family its own hunting grounds, marked out by certain natural divisions. It is at the peril of an intruder to trespass. This confirms that First Nations absolutely possessed strict property boundaries, recognized hunting grounds, and sophisticated systems of land management. The Europeans simply didn't recognize them because they didn't look like European boundaries. Historian Dr. Emma LaRocque provides some crucial analysis on this dynamic. She points out that Europeans labeled themselves as civilized while using derogatory terms like savages for indigenous peoples. She explains that the underlying assumption of this language was to place indigenous peoples at the very bottom of human development. This terminology wasn't just a casual insult, right? As the historical record shows, it was a specific worldview used by European powers to philosophically and legally justify taking ownership over First Nations land to build their own settlements. This clash of worldviews eventually became a physical reality. When France established permanent settlements in the early 1600s, they implemented the seigneurial system, where a landlord rented out strips of farmland to settlers. On the left, you can see a diagram from 1709 showing these long, mathematical rectangles of land dividing up the earth along the St. Lawrence River. And on the right, that's an aerial photo of the exact same area today. You can literally still see those distinct lines. The European worldview permanently marked the physical landscape in a way that remains totally visible centuries later. Trade connecting two worlds. Despite these massive clashes over who actually owned the land, there was one arena where these two competing worldviews were forced to cooperate. For European settlers, trade was mostly an economic transaction focused on wealth. But for First Nations, trade was an intricate, highly respected ceremony focused on building peace. First, trading nations would smoke a pipe to demonstrate goodwill and accept the heavy responsibilities of the trade. Second, gifts were exchanged purely as a sign of friendship. And third, because these nations had entirely distinct languages, they used a sophisticated form of sign language to communicate. It was a serious diplomatic event, not just a quick trip to the market. In this historical 1662 painting, we see explorers Radisson and Groseilliers negotiating trade. What this image really represents is profound dependency. Early Europeans completely depended on First Nations for their very survival in this harsh new climate. They had to trade for fresh food just to avoid starvation, canoes to navigate the rivers, and warm clothing like mittens and leggings just to make it through the freezing winters. And we have to remember that European arrival did not introduce trade to North America. Take a look at this piece of sharp volcanic glass called obsidian. Indigenous trade networks were highly advanced centuries prior. They were already regularly exchanging rare items across vast distances, things like this obsidian, buffalo hides, and medicinal items like bitterroot. When Europeans arrived, they were really just tapping into a massive, pre-existing continental economy. So the crucial point to take away from all this is that history is never just in the past. It lives on in the very structures of our modern world. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. How do these 300-year-old clashing views on land, ownership, and resource extraction continue to shape the world we live in today? When we look at modern debates over resources, development, and borders, we are still echoing the exact conversations of 1713. Keep seeking those connections, and thank you so much for joining me on this explainer.